Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay,
okay.
Perfect. So, well, thank you so much for the introduction. Good afternoon to everybody, and good morning to those in South America. As Jordi said, my name is Guillem Blasco-Piles, and I'm a PhD student at the Universitat de Barcelona, and my advisors are Ramon Muñoz and Federico Tadei. Today, I will present the preliminary version of my current research paper titled The Great Inner Divergence, TFP and Manufacturing Dualism in Industrializing Empires Before World War I. Before beginning, I would like to thank all the organizers for the opportunity to present my research in this workshop. And I apologize for anybody that read the manuscript version because of the changes that they are going to see here. But with no further ado, let's start. So in this research, in this inquiry, we wondered, what does a complete accounting of manufacturing productivity in late industrializing empires reveal about the Great Divergence? Well, before I start, allow me to set the stage first. In early 20th century, the Ottoman, the Qing, and the Russian Empire governed over 1 billion of people from the Balkans and Poland to the Pacific Ocean. And after several military defeats, like in the Balkan Wars for the Ottoman, the Crimean War between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman, and the Opium Wars for the Qing Empire, they realized their relative weakness and launched modernization programs that focused, but not exclusively, on the military. Yet, all three empires ultimately collapsed around the First World War. We could argue that this is the ultimate consequence of the Great Divergence, this inability to industrialize and converge in GDP per capita levels. But we still lack the systematic productivity metrics to encompass their economic situation and understand why they failed to industrialize. Previous studies examined labor productivity due to the difficulty to approach capital in these historical settings, and most of them also focused especially on large-scale establishments because they were more available already in the censuses, in the manufacturing censuses. However, this ignores 75 to 90% of the manufacturing workers that toiled in small establishments or in the cottage industry. Besides, no systematic comparison that allow us to bring light into these cases of failure of industrialization failure has been done. And this is the reason we wondered and established this research question. So therefore, this paper provides the first comprehensive total manufacturing productivity estimates for all three empires in the years that the manufacturing census were done. And we incorporate both the traditional industry and the capital. So in order to do so, we had to reconstruct the traditional sector. That means the number of establishments, the total output, the number of workers, from a synthesis of archival sources that were not previously integrated into the productivity analysis. Besides, we also had to estimate the capital in the traditional sector. We use horsepower as a proxy for capital, and as we will see. And to estimate so, we observed the usage of animal tools and water as an external source of energy in each of these empires and their associated horsepower from the contemporary sources in order to estimate so. Besides, we also use two production functions with distinct elasticities for the modern and the traditional establishments to recognize these different technological configurations that then we will aggregate them. Allow me to go deeper. So basically what we do in order to estimate this aggregate TFP in each empire, we do this dual technology TFP framework through input weighted aggregation. This dual technology TFP, as we said, it's basically a Cobb-Douglas production function for each type of establishment. The modern ones that are those that have more than 10 horsepower, and this includes factories and mechanized workshops. And another TFP another production function for traditional establishments that are those that have 10 horsepower or less. And this includes manufactories and artisanal workshops. So in order to obtain the aggregate, we basically weighted each production function, or the TFP deriving from it, by its relative usage of inputs. That includes the labor and capital. And that will reveal the overall true technological capabilities in each empire. Besides, to estimate the production function parameters, alpha and beta, when we were able, like in the modern Ottoman and Russian empires, we estimate them through OLS. And when we were not able due to multicollinearity issues or a number of observations, we reasoned and imposed them from what it was accepted in the literature. Besides, as I mentioned, to estimate the capital in the traditional establishments, basically what we did is for the animal power, we checked the the agricultural censuses and the availability of these animals in the economy, like oxen, donkeys, mules, horses. And from the mechanical engineering literature, we provide them their associated horsepower possibilities. For example, the benchmark is a horse with 1 horsepower, but an oxen has 0.9, and so on. For the humans, for the human power and machines and tools, what we use is basically from the mechanical engineering literature. We know that the basal rate of a human is 0.1 horsepower, and then with the tools that were used in the traditional sector, we acknowledge that it could reach a multiplying effect, reaching a threshold of 0.20, 25, depending on the tools used. Besides, we also saw the availability of water and the rivers that were in each of the empires, and from the Russian census that appear in some small establishments that were using water, we took that average usage of water and we use it for the several empires. One of the key findings in this methodology is that actually horsepower per workshop converges within a range despite very different compositions. And in order to do so, you have here the 3 manufacturing census conducted in a small time period that were used to obtain the data for the modern factories. And the 3 of them were conducted before the First World War, because during the war and afterwards it will get distorted. Besides, the literature considers that they were not made for tax collection, so therefore the incentives to lie and falsify data were lower. Therefore, they were more reliable for the data in the time. And also for the traditional, as I mentioned, we use several regional reports and contemporary sources for the traditional sector. Now, before I reveal the murderer of this story, allow me to say that our estimates of TFP for the different type of establishments and empires are robust across all possible specifications. So what we do, through the regressions we did, we observed that we could impose constant returns to scale. So basically what we did is we set different ranges for the labor elasticity alpha, ranging from 0.6 to 0.9. And what we saw is that with this increase in labor elasticity, all changes in respect to the UK of the TFP aggregates, and also for the modern and traditional, the changes were below 10%. And basically the story in any specification remain with the positions of the benchmark. And also the variability of each of the TFPs was quite small. So overall is how we can conclude that they were robust. And finally, allow me to present my results. So in the graph you're seeing right now, we normalize labor productivity in the modern establishments to 100, allowing us to reveal their internal dualism hidden before. One of the most striking things is what is the Ottoman Empire. That is the most extreme case. You can observe between the modern and the traditional a tenfold gap, while in the modern, capital was being used inefficiently. Many historical accounts like Edward Clark acknowledge for this situation descriptively, in which he narrates that basically in the Ottoman Empire model factories, they were importing machinery exclusively from England, but also France and Germany. And they had also to import engineers because they didn't know how to use the machines. And also it's also normal in processes of industrialization, in which first there is extensive growth through capital, and then there is an increase in TFP because of the learning by doing, right, of learning how to do the machines. In the Qing Empire case, we see that the gap is smaller, but there is an interesting pattern. The TFP, in this case, exceeds the labor productivity. Also, this has been acknowledged in the literature descriptively, and it suggested that there were artisanal skills, but in an environment of capital constraint, what would have made the TFP act like that regarding the labor productivity. And for the Russian Empire, we see the smallest gap, indicating more successful diffusion between sectors. But interestingly, when we check for the aggregate in each of the empires, we see that it lays quite close to the traditional one. And in the Russian case, it's a bit farther away. How is that? Well, from the composition, we see that is the weight of the traditional sector, of the usage of inputs, that it has much lower productivity. The most striking case is the Qing Empire, where the modern factories were only using 1% of all the inputs of labor and capital. And in the Ottoman case, we see that it's a bit better, but still, basically, this shows from a Lewis perspective that that the Ottoman and the Qing empires were pre-industrial economies with modern appendages. So even if the modern sector will be super productive, since they represented a minimum overall, they won't affect the aggregate. And in this situation, we can also see that in the Russian Empire, it presents signs of a structural transformation, as acknowledged in Cheremukhin, Guriev, and so on in 2017. Now, if we benchmark it to the United Kingdom, the acknowledged global productivity frontier, we see the relative position by types of establishments. Now, the most interesting fact is that the Ottoman modern factories were more productive than the Manchester mills. This means the English factories. Why? Well, it also relies on the composition. The explanation also lays on the composition. Basically, in the Ottoman Empire, we have really few super modern factories, about 802, that were really concentrated in Istanbul and Izmir. And basically what we can see here is that there were two manufacturing worlds, one, the modern and the traditional. And this follows what Şevket Pamuk described as enclave modernization. For the Qing case, we see how it overall collapses, and what we were considering as modern establishments were basically just manufactories or scaled up workshops with some machines rather than proper factories. And sorry, I forgot to mention something. So I mentioned that in the Ottoman Empire, there were two wars. So basically there was a missing middle. And this missing middle is the one that we see in the Russian Empire. So we see that there is much more compensated. There were much more mechanized workshops and in the modern sector and manufacturers in the traditional. So we see that the difference is smaller. Then previous estimates of labor productivity show that actually the Russian Empire was like 80% of the UK in productivity terms. However, from our aggregate, we show that it was more around the 60% of it. Still, we observe that it was industrializing, but the traditional sector still took its toll on the aggregate. Another curiosity we see is that when you compare the traditional between the Qing and the Ottoman empires that were pre-industrial, we see that they are really similar in productivities. So This could suggest some pre-industrial limits in productivity. However, further research should be done. It's just one of the insights we could see. But the most interesting thing overall, when we put the three in comparison, is that, especially in the Ottoman and in the Russian empires, the internal gap between the modern and the traditional is larger than their external gap with the UK from the aggregate, where the UK is 100%. So, besides, if we analyze the production function parameters that we estimated or imposed, we see that the Ottoman and Russian Empire modern establishments are quite similar among them. Also, the fact is that from the literature, we know that they are also similar to the ones presented in Germany for this time and the ones in the United States. So probably this is telling us that there was a successful adoption of the Western technology. Well, in the Qing case, basically, as we have been seeing throughout the whole presentation and results, basically it was a pre-industrial super labor-intensive economy. However, an interesting point raises here. We see that the differences between the capital intensity or beta between...
Guillem, you have 5 minutes left. 5 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I'm finishing already, actually. So the beta coefficients in the modern, the difference of beta coefficients between the modern and the traditional sector in the Ottoman and the Russian Empire are quite similar. However, as we have seen, their TFP measures are quite different. So this is suggesting us that also further research should be conducted, that there was something beyond. There was something in the Russian Empire that it was not in the Ottoman Empire. Probably we could say many channels, like probably a role of human capital, like in the Russian Empire, it has been discovered like the община, that means the commune, the agricultural commune, was not that rigid, so that allowed for some labor movement that could bring some spillovers from the modern factories. So because basically they were working in the summer in the fields, and then in the winter they were looking for some job. It could be also regarding the infrastructure and the relative more developed railroad network that was conducted in the Russian Empire. And it could also point for more rigid institutions that were restricting the allocation of capital in the Ottoman Empire that, in comparison. So overall, So what does a complete accounting of manufacturing productivity in late industrializing empires reveal about the Great Divergence? Well, first, what we have seen is there was extreme internal dualism, and in the Ottoman and Russian cases, in the Ottoman and Russian empires, the internal chasm exceeded the external one with the UK. Another finding was that basically we see three pathways. The Ottoman accomplished adoption of Western technology, but it couldn't diffuse it to the broader economy. The Qing, there was no adoption whatsoever and no diffusion, therefore. And in the Russian case, we saw that there was successful adoption and even partial diffusion to the broader economy. Also, what we saw overall is that including the traditional majorities matter, since they determine the aggregate regardless of the modern sector's success, as we saw specifically in the Ottoman Empire. So what we could suggest is that the Great Divergence persisted not through Western technological superiority, but from each empire's inability or incapacity to bridge the vast internal productivity chasms that existed, what we call and name the Great Inner Divergence. So, thank you so much. Muchas gracias. Hörke se te shekuler. Spasiba vám всё.